Now, Russia has launched what it's calling a counter-terrorism operation in numerous border areas after the biggest Ukrainian advance in Russia during the war so far. Moscow is sending military equipment to the Kursk region, where a state of emergency is in force. Hundreds of Ukrainian troops poured over the border on Tuesday, although Kyiv has not officially acknowledged the incursion.
Images the Russian Defense Ministry wants you to see. They allegedly show Russian jets striking Ukrainian forces on Russian soil, part of Moscow's response to Kyiv's incursion into the Kursk region. But Russia's forces are said to be scrambling to contain the Ukrainian offensive. On Friday, the Kremlin said it was sending more military hardware to the region, including rocket launchers, artillery, tanks and heavy trucks. Meanwhile, it was also pulling people out. Moscow has declared a federal-level emergency in the region and claims to have evacuated some 3,000 civilians. At a food distribution centre in the city of Kursk, people arriving from areas close to the Ukraine border said the situation was tense.
My grandfather is still there and I can't reach him. I've applied to have him evacuated, but no answer yet. They just say circumstances won't allow it.
All the border areas are currently under bombardment. The people here had to leave their homes because of the bombing.
By all accounts, the incursion by Ukraine appears to have been more successful than Moscow would like to admit. This video shows a convoy of 15 burnt-out Russian military trucks in the Kursk region. Russia's President Vladimir Putin held a meeting with the Security Council again on Friday, his third this week. He's cast the Ukrainian offensive as a major provocation. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky also held a meeting with his top defense officials on Friday. He said that his army chief had briefed him on, quote, the defensive actions taking place in areas used by Russia to launch airstrikes against Ukraine. Although Ukraine hasn't officially admitted carrying out the cross-border incursion, it appeared to justify the operation, considering Russian troops regularly conduct airstrikes from the Kursk region.
For more, I'm joined now by Domitila Sagramoso, Senior Lecturer in Security and Development at King's College London. It's good to have you with us again, Domitila. What more do we know about Russia's new operation to halt these advancing Ukrainian troops?
Well, we don't have a lot of details, but what we have seen is footage of military convoys, which involve light infantry, motorized light infantry, with T-62 tanks, artilleries, and rocket launchers. So there is an effort, of course, by Russia to try to send forces, which in many cases is primarily composed of reserve forces, to the area. It is not clear yet whether they are mobilizing forces that are deployed inside Ukraine, which is probably one of the objectives that the Ukrainians were trying to achieve, to ensure that there is sort of a diversion of forces away from the more critical areas on the front lines, because this also would take quite a bit of time. But, you know, it cannot be excluded. There are reports that forces are being moved from areas such as Kupiansk, Kharkiv, but I think it's too early to tell exactly what kind of forces are being deployed in that area.
I want to come back to what you said about Ukraine's strategy, but first, this mobilization is coming at the heels of one of the biggest incursions of its kind that in this war so far. What does this tell us about Russia's existing defense capabilities?
Well, it is clear that this was a very weak spot, that Russia hadn't really set up proper defensive lines, proper lines of protection, as they did inside Ukraine, the so-called Surovikin line, which was very well set up with very strong defensive lines, mines, and these kind of fortifications have not been set up in these areas because probably the Russians never thought that the Ukrainians would dare such kind of attacks in these areas. And of course, the Ukrainians try to find these weak points. So it clearly indicates that this is great sort of deficiencies on the Russian side. Also because there were intelligence reports that the Russians apparently received that this kind of concentration of forces on the Ukrainian side of the border in the areas, of course, was taking place. But it was dismissed by sort of the higher echelons of the Russian military. So here also we see sort of a weak assessment of intelligence that is coming in. So that is also problematic. So we have the combination of these two elements of lack of preparedness and lack of attention of intelligence that is coming up.
Clearly something that Ukraine seemingly has managed to exploit. Thank you so much for that. Domitila Sagramoso from King's College, London.
And let's bring in our correspondent in Kyiv, Nick Connolly. Nick, do we have any indication of how far Ukraine is trying to go here?
This is a very difficult question, given that there are no independent journalists on the ground. We are relying on either locals, Russian locals in Kursk region posting stuff to social media, which is increasingly dangerous for them. We've had reports of Russian civilians who'd posted videos of the results of Ukrainian attacks being arrested, detained, or the so-called military bloggers. These are Russian bloggers that are close to the Russian military and obviously have an agenda. So there has been talk of the fact that maybe the Ukrainians had initially gone further deeper into into Russian territory rather, heading maybe towards the city of Kursk or the Kursk nuclear power station. Now reports that maybe those were just kind of outrider attacks, and they're now focusing more on heading east and west along the border, so kind of a long sliver, a kind of buffer zone along the border rather than going deep into Kursk region. We simply don't know. It seems like there's a lot of opportunism here, that basically the Ukrainian side wasn't expecting this to be as easy as it has proven to be. They weren't expecting the Russians to be as unprepared as has been the case, and so they're basically trying to see what they can get and work out on the ground what this is going to be. Are they going to be disappearing back up across the border soon, or is this something where they're going to be digging in to then potentially exchange this territory somewhere down the line?
Will Russia be able to reinforce its defences quick enough?
Well, that's been the kind of very interesting story. Already you've got the blame game running on the Russian side, especially some Chechen units that were meant to be protecting the border, basically coming out and saying, well, the Ukrainians just rushed past us. We tried to defend the border, but suddenly they were behind us inside Russian territory. So seemingly the defensive lines built by the Russian side here not very effective, unlike those defensive lines that the Russians have built in occupied Ukraine. And it seems like the Ukrainians knew where those defenses were. There seemingly weren't huge minefields, and so they were able to clear those defensive lines pretty quickly and basically overtake any defences that were there. And we understand obviously Russian forces are thinly spread right now. They're trying to attack all across the front lines in Ukraine. So they largely these were, with the exception of those Chechen forces, people doing their military service and kind of local law enforcement rather than kind of battle-hardened troops.
How are people in Kyiv reacting to the developments?
I think it's definitely changed the mood, the tone here in Kyiv. Obviously, there's been months of bad news, not catastrophic, but bad news from the east. And this has shown that Ukraine can, out of nowhere, basically without much in the way of a kind of announcement or the kind of expectations that we had last year of that counteroffensive, basically change the rules of the game and take everyone by surprise. There's also been a lot of kind of happiness here in Ukraine that Western countries have not come down hard on this, have not seemingly tried to stop Ukraine doing this. There've been lots of talk of red lines and Western countries not wanting to provoke Russia. That seemingly is now not an issue. So I think the political side, that this shows that Ukraine is not going to be railroaded in some kind of agreement on Russian terms. That is something that people are seeing as incredibly positive here.
Intriguing developments from Nick Connolly in Kyiv for us.